All right, so chapter 4 is on tissues, level of organization. So when it comes to the levels of organization that we've talked about, we've said that we, of course, have the molecular level, and then we have the cellular level, so cells, and then we have tissues, and then we have organs, and then we have organ systems, and then we have organisms. Okay, so we'll talk about tissues, but it's very difficult to talk about tissues without talking about cells, because a whole bunch of cells put together make tissues. But it's also very difficult to talk about tissues without talking about the organs, because a whole bunch of tissues together will make up an organ. Okay, so we end up talking about these three together. Okay, just because the tissues are related to all three of them. Okay, so we have 4 types of tissue, 4 main categories of tissues. Okay, connective, muscle, epithelial, and nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is also called neural tissue. Okay, so with connective tissue, it's actually the most complex type of tissue, so that's what I choose to start with. Okay, I'll use a flow chart today that I will give to you tomorrow. I'll print out a copy and give to you. Okay, so you can copy it if you want, but if you don't want to copy it, I will get this flow chart to you. So connective tissue has categories to it. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this. So this is in my handwriting. Okay, so there are 3 categories of connective tissue that we look at. So there's connective tissue proper. Okay, that's the first category. Fluid connective tissue and supporting connective tissue. So those are 3 major categories. Okay, and the connective tissue proper, its main function, well, all the tissues have a function of protection, but the connective tissue proper also connects certain structures. Okay, so we have subcategories that you also need to know. So we have loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Okay, so the loose connective tissue is called loose because it has few elastic fibers, few protein fibers in it. Okay, so some characteristics of connective tissue we talk about is that in order to recognize a connective tissue easily, you'll find a lot of protein fibers on there. Okay, so that's one way that you can use to recognize it. So there are a bunch of protein fibers on there. Okay, something else that you will find on there is ground substance. Okay, so protein fibers and ground substance. Ground substance is basically like a jello-like material that is found in between the cells that make up the tissue. So it packs in between so that the tissue itself stays intact. So we call that ground substance. Okay, and so when you talk about loose connective tissue as a type of connective tissue proper, the reason why it gets the word loose is because it has few of these protein fibers. It doesn't have as many protein fibers, but then it has a lot more ground substance. Okay, so the fewer the protein fibers, the more likely you are to call it loose. So if it's a dense connective tissue, then it will have a lot of these protein fibers. Okay, all right, the loose connective tissue is going to be subdivided. Okay, so this is where you need to know these subdivisions. Okay, make sure you are able to remember them. So there's the areola, the adipose, and reticular are the subcategories of loose connective tissue. Okay? And then when it comes to dense connective tissue, the subcategories are regular, irregular, and elastic. Okay? Now, let's talk about loose connective tissue first before we move on. Okay? The areola is found under the skin, so I'm not going to ask you where it's found. If I want you to know where it's found, I'll tell you, and I'll have you put an asterisk, okay, on there, so you can remember to study it that way, okay? But you'll just need to know the subcategories of loose connective tissue. What categories are these three, okay? The easiest way to recognize areola tissue is when you're looking at it, you're going to look for two structures on there. You're going to look for elastic fibers, okay? Because there are two kinds of protein fibers here. There are elastic fibers, and then there are collagen fibers, okay? So with areola tissue, look for elastic fibers and collagen fibers. The elastic fibers so elastic and collagen fibers. The elastic fibers are going to be they look like sewing thread, really skinny and dark, like sewing thread, a thread that you use to sew your clothes. This is what elastic look like. And then the collagen fibers look like a piece of tape. So they're wide like a tape. They're flat and they're almost clear, but they're not completely clear, okay? So that is collagen fibers. So when you're looking at it, now what I'll do is I'm going to go back and forth between your lab exam information and this slide, so I can show you how these tissues look like, okay? All right, so that's areola tissue right here. Okay, this is in your lab exam 1 info, okay? So in your lab exam, you'll need to know, be able to identify the collagen fibers and the elastic fibers, okay? So do you see these pink? This tissue is not pink, okay? The tissue itself is not pink. It's stained. We use a certain dye or stain to make it look pink so you can see it easily under a microscope, okay? Anyway, if you can see this pink, okay, it looks like tape. It looks like a piece of tape, long pieces of tape or ribbon. I don't know, whichever one you want it to be. Okay, those are going to be the collagen fibers. Okay, so that's collagen fiber, like that one, that's a collagen fiber. They're all over the place. Okay, so those are collagen fibers. There's one too. Okay, so those are collagen fibers. The elastic fibers are going to be, they are going to be the dark ones that look like sewing thread, like thread you use to sew your clothes. Okay, here's another one right here, that one. That's an elastic fiber. Okay, they're everywhere. This one too, right here. Okay, so those are elastic fibers. So when you're trying to recognize these tissues, just look for some distinct characteristics that give away the tissues, but that's how you would recognize areolar tissue, okay? You wouldn't need to worry about the adipose tissue, so don't worry about that, and the reticular tissue. And then with the dense connective tissue, you have the regular, irregular, and elastic. With those ones, you also don't need to worry about them, okay? So just the list that you've been given is what you will need to just focus on, okay? Okay. Let's talk about fluid connective tissue. The word fluid means that it's just a liquid, okay? The function of fluid connective tissue is to transport. So something must be in it to be moved around, so transportation, okay? So with fluid connective tissue, we have some subcategories here, okay? So you're looking at blood is a fluid, okay? Lymph is a clear fluid. If you cut yourself with a knife, you don't bleed, but there's still fluid coming out. That clear fluid is lymph. And then water is just what makes up blood. It's in a lot of your blood is water, and a lot of lymph is also water. And then matrix. So matrix is just a combination of those protein fibers that we talked about and ground substance together. It's kind of like a slushy. If you've ever gone to Sonic and you ask for a slushy, it's not really liquid. It's not really like solid. It's like in between. We call it's slushy. That's how matrix is. It's slushy like that. Okay. So with blood, okay, blood contains some different types of cells. So you have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are the components that are found in blood, that the cells that we find in blood, okay? Now, in your lab exam, I'm going to use, again, it's easier for me to use these slides, okay? This is a blood tissue that you would need to recognize, okay? So all these red structures, those are red blood cells, okay? They're easy to recognize. Why? Because they're going to be red. And when you take your lab exam, even though it will be on paper, it's going to be in color. So there's no way you can mistake the red blood cells, okay? The white blood cells are going to be the ones that have a nucleus. So red blood cells don't have a nucleus, okay? Red blood cells are the only cells in your body that don't have a nucleus, okay? Which is really strange, but you're like, well, if they don't have a nucleus, then how does the cell repair itself? Because the nucleus is the one that repairs the cell. Well, if a red blood cell gets damaged, it's done. There's no repairing it. You just make new ones, okay? So we don't worry about it because you make so many per second anyways. So if it gets damaged, it is done, okay? Other cells, the reason why they have a nucleus is that if a cell gets damaged, there's an attempt to repair it. If it can be repaired, then we get rid of it. But typically the nucleus can repair the damage within other cells, okay? So with our white blood cells, white blood cells, we have, in this case, these are not all the white blood cells, but the neutrophil and a lymphocyte. Okay? Okay, so they have a nucleus. Okay, so the way you're going to recognize a neutrophil and lymphocyte is the shape of the nucleus, okay? So the neutrophil, this is a neutrophil, by the way, right here, okay? A neutrophil has, this is the nucleus. This weird looking structure in there, that's a nucleus, Okay, so a neutrophil, a neutrophil will have a nucleus that kind of looks like an embryo, you know, like an what becomes a baby in there. It looks like an embryo in there, or what we call a multi-lobed nucleus. So these are lobes, like these circular structures, they're lobes. So if it's many lobes, we use the word multi. So it's multi-lobed nucleus. Okay, a lymphocyte. Do you see inside here? This is the nucleus. This round structure in there is the nucleus. It has a perfectly round nucleus, is a lymphocyte. Okay, so those are the only two. It doesn't mean there are only two types of white blood cells. We're just saying for this class, you're only going to be responsible for recognizing these two types of white blood cells. Okay, and let me write those descriptions for you here. Now, for your lecture exams, you're not going to be identifying this, but I figured I could kill two birds with one stone since I'm talking about the tissue part and just show you which ones they are. So we say it has a multi-lobed nucleus or looks like an embryo. That's what it looks like to me. And then the lymphocyte, it has a perfectly round nucleus. Okay. Okay. So that's fluid connective tissue. And then there's supporting connective tissue. And with supporting connective tissue, their main job is to just support structures within the human body. And that's why you have bone on there. And then you have cartilage. Okay, let's start with bone. Okay, the structure of the tissue, the bone tissue, or what we call the osseous tissue, is to me, it looks more like a tree trunk. Okay, if you've ever seen a tree trunk with rings on it, that's what bone tissue looks like to me. It makes it easy to recognize these tissues if you, in your mind, you can picture them as something you are familiar with. It's going to make it easy for you to remember. So this is how bone tissue looks like. Okay, to me, see these rings? It looks like a tree trunk. Okay, with those rings, or it does to me, anyways. And so with bone tissue, let me write that. To me, it looks like a tree trunk. All right, so the structures that you will need to recognize would be the central canal. See right there in the middle? We call that the central canal. That's where the blood vessels run within the bone. They run up and down the central canal. Okay? The lacunae are those black dots that you see on there. All those black dots you see on there. Like that one. Or that one. Okay? Any of these black dots right here. Everywhere. Okay, so they're everywhere. Those are called lacunae. Okay, why are they so important? They're important because the cells, the bone cells, are located. The bone cells called osteocytes are located in the lacunae. They're in there, okay? And then the lamella are just the rings. Like each ring is considered a lamella. So I'm just gonna sketch it right here, okay? So this is what it looks like, right? Okay, so like the spaces in between. So like, I'm trying to find a different color here so I don't mix them up. So like, you know, this space right there, okay? Or that space right here. We call that the lamella, okay? The space between the rings, I guess, is what I mean. Okay, so that's called lamella. Okay. So another name for bone tissue is osseous tissue. Okay. And then, of course, you have 3 types of cartilage. Okay. You have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Okay. Now, with these, I need you to note somewhere, put somewhere in your notes that you will need to know the location. What you will need to know where hyaline cartilage is found, where elastic cartilage is found, and where fibrocartilage is found. Now, elastic is going to be pretty simple because the ear is the only example that I will give to you. If you pull your ear, it feels elastic, right? Because it retracts. Yes, that's because your ear is basically made up of elastic cartilage. So that's the easiest one. So you'd put elastic cartilage on there. Is the ear. Okay, and then the hyaline cartilage is going to be more like a thin type of cartilage. So you will find it between like your ribs and your sternum, you'll find it there, and then between your trachea. So it's thinner. And then the fibrocartilage is thick. Okay, this type of cartilage is really thick, so it's padded. So that's why you'll find it like in your knee pads, like the meniscus, okay? Like in between your knees, between your femur and your tibia, you know, you have pads on there, knee pads in there, called your meniscus. Those are a type of fibrocartilage, okay? So they're thick. And then the intervertebral discs, I'll show you where those are. So they're between your vertebrae, okay? Those are a fibrocartilage, okay? Now I'll show you how elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage look like. But what you do need to know about cartilage, and I need you to remember, and I mentioned this already, is the word chondros, okay? The word chondros means cartilage, okay? Which means that if cartilage is tissue and cells make tissue, then the cells of cartilage will be called what? Okay, someone type that in the chat as an answer. Let me repeat the question. If cells make tissues, right, and cartilage is a tissue, and that another word for cartilage is chondros. So what are the cells of cartilage called, based on you knowing that cartilage is called chondros and cartilage is a tissue? So what are the cells called? Can someone type that in the chat box? Thank you. Chondrocytes. Okay. All right. So then the cells that make the cartilage tissue will be chondrocytes. So when you're looking at hyaline and elastic. No, you're not going to look at hyaline. You'll only look at elastic and fibrocartilage. Look for chondrocytes on there. You know you're going to label them. Okay, so let me share that lab exam 1 information with you again. And let me look at elastic cartilage first. Now, to me, elastic cartilage, it's found in your ears, correct? So to me, the elastic cartilage, they look like ears to me anyways, okay? When I look at them, these look like a bunch of ears put together, okay? So it makes sense that it's found in the ear and they look like ears, okay? I don't know. That's what they look like to me. And then, of course, since this is a tissue, these are the cells. So these are all chondrocytes right here. That's a chondrocyte. That's a chondrocyte. Lacunae is just the shell. See this outside shell on here? That's lacunae. But that's a chondrocyte. That's a chondrocyte. Each one of these is a chondrocyte, is a cell, because they pack together to make the tissue. Okay? So the outside shell right here, that's called a chondrocyte. A lacunae, sorry. It's called a lacunae. The inside part, that's the chondrocyte. Okay? Okay, so that's elastic cartilage found in the ear. The fibrocartilage, I'm also looking for chondrocytes. So do you see these dots here, these structures right here? These are chondrocytes. Okay? And then the lacunae is just the shell on the outside surrounding the chondrocyte. Okay, which ones are the collagen fibers? Do you see those stringy structures, the waves? Okay, they're individual, but they're packed so much together that, I don't know, you might not be able to see them, but I can see them pretty easily. But maybe it's because I've looked at these tissues for 40 years of my life. So anyway, so these stringy structures, those are the collagen fibers on there, okay? So all those individual string-like structures, those are the collagen fibers. And then these dots right here, those would be the chondrocytes, okay? So I would say the collagen fibers are the string-like. Okay? And that's pretty much connective tissue. Okay, so that's all you need to know. So the categories and subcategories, and again, I will print out this flowchart for you. I will have that for you tomorrow to pick up during lab, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so we'll move on to another type of tissue unless anybody has questions on there. Okay, we'll take a look at epithelial tissue. Okay, so I'm going to skip muscle tissue for now because it's pretty easy. There's not much on it, so I'll do that second to last. Let's take a look at epithelial tissue because there's so much information on it. Okay, all right. So when it comes to epithelial tissue, right here, this tissue produces a lot of fluid. It's very moist. Epithelial tissue is very moist, produces a bunch of fluid. There's a lot of structures that we call cilia on there that are going to push the fluids around. Okay, so there's those fluids, they go in and out of the cell. Okay, so this type of tissue does a lot of controlling how much fluid goes in and out of the cell on there. And the tissue covers different structures within the human body. So of course it is for protection. Okay, so we look at characteristics of epithelial tissue, and you do need to know these characteristics. Okay, so the first one that we talk about is polarity. Okay, so polarity just means that epithelial tissue has opposite sides to it, so it has a top and a bottom. That is what polarity means. It means that epithelial tissue has a top, which we call it the apical surface, and a bottom. That's what it has, two opposite sides, a top and a bottom. Okay, so we call that's the characteristics of polarity. Okay, and so the top part, the basal, we don't talk much about the bottom surface, but the top part, the apical part. Okay, so the apical portion has two structures. It has a structure called cilia and another structure we call microvilli. So let me show you those, and then I'll come back to this page again. So that's polarity right there. Okay, cilia are going to be these tiny hair-like structures, and then microvilli are even tinier right there, microscopic microvilli. Okay, the function of cilia is going to be to push fluids around the cell. So there's always liquid around the cell. Okay, so the cilia is going to be what moves fluids around the cell. Okay, the microvilli are going to be what allows for absorption of materials into the cell, or also secretion of fluid. So remember I said epithelial tissue are very moist, so there must be some structures that are producing this fluid. So it is these microvilli that are producing these fluids. Okay. So they move, cilia will move fluid around. And then the microvilli are going to be for absorption and secretion of a whole bunch of material. Okay. Okay, and then there's a characteristic of cellularity. Now I will ask you, I guarantee you during an exam, I'll say which of the following is not a characteristic of epithelial tissue, which of the following is a characteristic of epithelial tissue. Okay, so you need to know these characteristics. Okay, a cellularity just means that the cells pack together to form the tissue. They're closely packed together to form a tissue. So we call that cellularity. That's the characteristic of cellularity. So I'll write that down here. I'll say we'll say the cells are packed together to form the tissue. Okay, so we call that cellularity. Okay, so what I'm saying is, I'm going to try and draw it here with my pen. Gotta get a really thin one. So if you look at it, for example, so they pack together. Okay. So each individual round structure that you see on there is a cell. Okay. So I would say that each individual blue circle is a cell. But the entire structure is a tissue. The entire structure is a tissue. So one of these is a cell, okay? So that's a cell. You can put numbers on them if you want. So each one is a cell, and then together, this is all an epithelial tissue, okay? And so then these cells, these individual cells, they're connected using structures we call junctions, okay? So the individual cells are connected using structures we call junctions. We call them cell junctions. Okay, so we have 3 types of cell junctions, so I'll go over these. Okay, so the first one, we call it a tight junction. And a tight junction, it's mainly, it's like a sheet. It's like a black, like, not like a black, but like a blank sheet, okay? Or like a metal sheet, flat, thin sheet that's found in between the cells. We call it a tight junction, okay? So its function is it mainly prevents passage of water and solutes. Solutes are really tiny substances, but it's not water. Passage of water and solutes from one cell to another, because these cells are connected, okay? So that's called a tight junction, okay? I'll show you the pictures in a minute here, okay? And then the second one, we call it a desmosome. The desmosome let me draw it. The desmosome is, it's round. It looks like cement. This is what desmosomes look like. They're like cement, okay? So their job is to tie cells together. So you see these individual cells that we're talking about right here? Let me see. This one's, it glues them together, okay? So the desmosomes, it glues cells together. Okay, so that's the second one. And then the third one is gap junctions. A gap is a space, correct? So the gap junctions, they look like desmosomes, but they have holes in them. Okay, so let me draw that. So they look like that, but they will have holes in them. Okay, since they have holes in them, they're going to allow small molecules to be shared between cells. So they'll pass through in between cells to be shared. Okay, so those are gap junctions. So they will allow small molecules to be shared between cells, hence the word gap. Okay, so if you take a look, let me see if I can find that. And this should be in your PowerPoint. If you go back to your PowerPoint, you should be able to see that in one of your pictures. So this is, here we go. All right, so this flat sheet in between the blue on there, that's a tight junction. These solid, oh, let me backtrack. Do you see this rectangular structure? That's one cell. This is another cell. They've just made a coronal cut, so you can actually see inside it. Okay, so you can see it from the front on there. Okay, but this is considered one cell. This is another cell next to it. Okay, so these two cells are tied together using these desmosomes right there. Okay, and then this cell and this cell are capable of sharing nutrients and fluids, and the nutrients and fluids can just pass back and forth using gap junctions. So these are gap junctions, and they have holes in them. And so substances can just pass through from one cell to another. So that if one cell is deficient of nutrients, then it can just borrow from the other cell. So they share nutrients pretty easily. Okay, so that's what cellularity means. Okay. Now the next characteristic that we talk about is attachment. Okay, and we say that epithelial tissues will attach to other cells using structures we call the basement cells, using structures we call the basement membrane. Okay, so attachment is our next characteristic. Okay, we say that epithelial tissue will attach to other structures using the basement membrane. Okay, so the basement membrane is at the bottom. Now, epithelial tissue, I need you to note this, put this somewhere in your notes. This is the only type of tissue out of the 4 types of tissue that has a basement membrane. So no other tissue will have a basement membrane. Is the only type of tissue that has a basement membrane. Okay. Okay, and the basement membrane will be at the bottom. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like. Take a look at your PowerPoint notes if you have those open or printed out. At the bottom here, that's the basement membrane. Okay. Okay. Avascularity. The term avascularity just means that epithelial tissue does not contain blood vessels. The term vascular means blood vessels. When you add an A on there, if you've taken medical terminology class before, if you add A or AN in front of a word, it means no or without, okay? So avascularity means without blood vessels. So we say that epithelial tissue does not contain blood vessels. Vascular means kind of from cardiovascular, vascular blood vessels. So epithelial tissue does not contain blood vessels. And the last characteristic is that epithelial tissue regenerates. It means that if this tissue gets damaged, it's going to repair itself really, really well, to the point where it looks like it was never damaged in the first place, okay? So regeneration means that epithelial tissue repairs itself really well. Okay, so that's what regeneration means. Okay, so those are the characteristics of epithelial tissue that you need to know. Okay, so now we take a look at how we are able to recognize epithelial tissue. Okay, so if we are characterizing them and recognizing them, we recognize epithelial tissue based on how many layers they have of cells, and we use the shape of the cells. Those are the two ways you're going to use to recognize epithelial tissue. How many layers? Shape of cells, okay? Right there. Okay, so we classify by how many layers? Okay, so we use how many layers, and then we use by the shape of cells, okay? If the tissue has one layer of cells, so the cells are lined up in just one line, then we call it simple, okay? So the term simple means one layer of cells, just one layer. The term simple means one layer of cells. And then if it's stratified, it means that there are several layers of cells. So anything more than one is considered several. Okay, so do you see this is one? These are individual cells, but they're all in one line. Okay, they're all just lined up in one layer. But if they're in several layers, like this one, then we use the word stratified. Okay, so stratified means more than one layer. Okay, so simple is one layer, stratified is more than one layer. Okay, so that's one way to characterize or classify epithelial tissue. The other way we classify is based on shape. Okay, so there are three shapes that we use. Okay, so the shapes are going to be, it's either going to be squamous. Okay, squamous means it is thin and flat shape. Okay, So the term squamous means thin and flat. The shape might be cuboidal, which means it looks like a box. Okay? It means like looks like a box. Or the shape might be columnar, which means it looks like long columns or long cylinders. Whatever way you want to describe it is up to you. Okay, so they're long and thin, like columns or like cylinders is columnar. That's the third shape. Okay, so we say looks like columns, or I would say cylinders. Okay, so that would be columnar. Okay, so now to name them, to name these epithelial tissue, we combine the shape and the layers. That's how we name them. Okay, so for example, if it's one layer of thin and flat cells, then it would be simple squamous epithelium or simple squamous epithelial tissue. So you could call it epithelial tissue or epithelium, but you need to put one of them. Okay, you just can't say simple squamous. That's not enough. You have to put either epithelium or epithelial tissue. Okay, if the shapes are boxy and it's just one row of cells, then it is simple cuboidal. And then one row of columns, it's simple columnar. If it's many layers, it would be a stratified of thin and flat, stratified squamous, or stratified cuboidal, many layers of boxes. Okay, so this is one layer, this is considered another layer. Or if it's many columns, it would be stratified columnar epithelium. So that's how we label them. Okay, now we talk about where we find these tissues. So you're going to need to know where we find these tissues, and this is where I will use I'll use a flowchart, and you can copy this flowchart, but make sure you know the location of these tissues. Okay, so I ended up dividing these . I put them in categories here, so they're easier to see. So I put them as squamous, cuboidal, and then columnar. Okay, so like a simple squamous epithelium. First of all, if you're looking at it, you look at it from the top. So when you look at it from the top, it will look almost like a fried egg. Okay, I'll show you during lab tomorrow. It's easier to show you in person. Okay, but it looks somewhat like that. So we say it has a fried egg look, is what we say. We say it has a fried egg look. Looks like a fried egg. Okay, so that's a simple squamous. Okay, where do we mostly find it? Mainly your body cavities. It's going to line mostly body cavities. What body cavities am I talking about? Like pleural cavity, okay? Or like your pericardial cavity, right? Or what? Pelvic cavity, okay? This is where you would find this kind of tissue, okay? And then, of course, the stratified squamous is many layers of flat cells, correct? So usually you'll find stratified squamous in extreme ends of your body, like the extreme top and the extreme bottom. So the extreme top would be like your mouth, the lining of your mouth, and your esophagus, which is that tube that sends food to your stomach. That's the extreme top. The extreme bottom would be your rectum, your anus, and the vagina. Okay, so that's how I make it easy to remember. So just think of, I'll say it's found in, I say, extreme ends of the bodies. Okay. So the extreme ends of the body are going to be, let's see, extreme top would be mouth, esophagus, and then all the way in the bottom would be rectum is there, anus is there, and then in females, the vagina is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Okay. And then simple cuboidal, your kidney tubules is where you'd find your simple cuboidal epithelium. Your kidney tubules are those tubules where water is like absorbed in and out of the body. Okay. Let me show you a picture of it, of the kidney tubules. Let's see. Here. Share this with you. Where are they? Kidney tubules. Here they are. Okay, so these are the kidney tubules. Okay, so that's where you would find simple cuboidal. Okay, so see this one layer of cells? This is the tube itself. Okay, so it lines on the outside. Okay, so that would be a main area. So I'd say kidney tubules. Okay, the stratified cuboidal is a pretty rare type of tissue, and so it is found. The two places we can say is the mammary gland ducts. The mammary gland ducts are those tubes that will eject milk out of the mammary gland of a lactating mother. Okay. Or sweat gland ducts is where you will find them as well. So that's stratified cuboidal. Okay, so it is somewhat rare. Okay, so found in mammary glands. Ducts and sweat gland, your sweat glands, ducts, those tubes that will allow sweat to leave your body, they're lined with the stratified cuboidal. Okay. All right, and then simple columnar, since they look like long columns, the way I try to remember is that simple columnar are long, skinny columns, a line of long, skinny columns. When I think of that, to me, I think of how long and skinny your small intestines are. Okay, so mainly you will find simple columnar lining your digestive tract from your stomach to your rectum. So your stomach, your small intestines, your large intestines, and your rectum will have simple columnar. Okay, so to me, that's the easiest way to remember. Okay, so don't try and really memorize this for word to word. Just think about how these columns look like, and they're long and thin, and they remind you of how intestines look like. You're going to remember where they're found. Okay, so they line digestive tract from stomach to rectum. Okay, so stomach to rectum. Okay, so small intestines, large intestines, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, and rectum. Okay. Okay, and then the stratified columna, where you find it really varies. Okay, so it's not a specific place, so it varies. So not specific. So I wouldn't necessarily ask you to remember this one, but I will tell you some areas where it is found. Okay, so but I wouldn't say don't worry too much about this. So the anus will actually have a stratified columna, and then mammary glands will have them too. Okay, so we're not saying that these areas have only one type of tissue. So there's some areas that have more than one type of tissue. Okay, so like your throat, that's called the pharynx, will also have stratified columnar epithelium. Okay. I think that might be too small. Okay. And then we have a type of tissue that doesn't follow the same rules. So it's called a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It's pseudo because the word pseudo means false. So it's falsely stratified. So in some areas, it looks like it's one layer of cells. In some areas, it looks like it's many layers of cells. So it's falsely stratified. So we call it pseudostratified ciliated because it has cilia, those little hairs at the top. It mainly lines your respiratory and so mainly lines respiratory and reproductive tract. Okay. Okay. So mainly lines respiratory and reproductive tract. So let me show you what the okay, so let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so let me share this with you. Okay, where is it? Right here. Okay, pseudo, false, stratified. Okay, so if you take a look at this, some areas, this is the basement membrane at the bottom. So they all have a basement membrane. So over here, like right there, so that looks like it's one layer because it starts from the bottom to the top. And then over here, there are two cells. So it looks like it's two layers. And then over here, it's like it's two, 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 two. And then over here, it looks like it's one layer of cells. So you're not sure whether it's simple or if it's stratified, so you're confused about it, then it means it's pseudostratified. Ciliated means that it has cilia, those little hairs at the top. Okay. And that's where the name comes from. Okay. Now there's another one that doesn't follow those rules as well. Okay, so it doesn't follow the how many layers and shape rules. There's one other one, and we call that a transitional epithelium. To transition means to change. Okay, so you're changing from one thing to another. So a transitional epithelium is a type of tissue that doesn't have a specific shape. It changes shape whenever the tissue is stretched. For example, your urinary bladder is lined with transitional epithelium type of tissue because when your bladder is empty, then the lining of it that has the transitional epithelium has tissue that is mainly more of rounded. Okay, so the tissue is more rounded because it's not being pulled apart. And then when your bladder is full, then the lining then stretches, and so these cells then become more like flat. They flatten out. So they're not a specific shape like the cuboidal and the columnar, you know, and the squamous. They don't stay that shape. They will transition based on stretching, and that's a transitional epithelium. So transitional epithelium doesn't have a specific shape, so it transitions or changes, okay? So that's our other category besides the pseudostratified ciliated columna that doesn't follow those rules is the transitional epithelium. So what I'll do is I'll just put it epithelium. So what I'll do is I'll just put it here as an asterisk of some sort, and I will say that transitional epithelium is the other type of tissue. And what it does is that it changes shape during stretching. And the location of it, or the most predominant place where you would find transitional epithelium, just think of your urinary bladder. Okay. Okay. So that's pretty much epithelial tissue. Any questions on epithelial tissue? Okay. The other type of tissue that we talk about is muscle tissue. Okay, so there are three types of muscle tissue. So we have skeletal, we have cardiac, and we have smooth muscle tissue. Okay, so they look pretty similar, but they have some differences about them that we'll talk about. So three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. Okay, so what I did is for this one, I just put a table on there because it makes it easier to look at the similarities and the differences. Okay, so the skeletal muscle tissue, what does it look like? So when you look at it, they are long and cylindrical. So if you look at them, they look like long cylinders. Okay, so long and cylindrical. Okay, cardiac muscle tissue, if you look at it, it looks like it has branches to it, like branches on a tree. Okay, so something like that. So it somewhat looks like skeletal muscle tissue, but the reason why you wouldn't confuse them is once you see the branches, then you'll know, okay, it's not skeletal, it's cardiac. And then smooth muscle tissue, basically it looks spindle shaped, okay, or it is tapered. Okay, spindle shaped or tapered means that it is thick in the middle and then it's skinny on the ends. That's what it looks like. Okay, so that's how we describe them. So skeletal, we say it's long and looks like a cylinder, so we say cylindrical. Okay, and then cardiac muscle tissue, we talk about it being short and branched. Okay, so it has branches to it. And then smooth muscle tissue, we say that it is tapered. We call it tapered or spindle shaped. Tapered or spindle shaped means thick in the middle, skinny at the ends, like eyes, like our eyes. Our eyes are kind of in the middle, they're kind of wide, and then they become small towards the edges, right? Where the top and the bottom eyelids meet, it gets smaller. That's what spindle shaped looks like. Okay. And then in terms of, we look at the nucleus, we talk about if it's single nucleated or multinucleated. What that means is that when you look at the tissue and you look at the cells that make the tissue, do they just have one nucleus per cell or many nuclei per cell? Okay, so the only one that is multinucleated is the skeletal muscle tissue. Okay, everybody else is single nucleated. Okay, what this means is many nuclei per cell. Okay, and then these other ones, cardiac and smooth muscle tissue, will only have one single nucleus per cell. So if you're trying to remember the characteristics, just think of them in groups, group them like this and say cardiac and smooth muscle tissue are single nucleus per cell. And then skeletal muscle tissue is multinucleated. And then we ask the question, is it striated or non-striated? Striated means that if you look at it, does it have stripes on it? Okay, does it have stripes on it? And I'll show you in a minute here. The skeletal muscle tissue is going to be striated. Okay, cardiac muscle tissue is going to be striated as well. And then the smooth muscle tissue, it has no striations, so it is not striated. Okay, so when you look at it and you look at the skeletal muscle tissue, okay, when you draw it, these are striations. Okay, if you look at cardiac muscle tissue and you draw it and you see the stripes, those are the striations. And then the smooth muscle tissue, it will just look like that. No striations on there. Okay, so let me put here that the striations are like stripes. They look like stripes on there. Okay, so then we talk about regeneration like we do in epithelial tissue. So we say that when the tissue gets damaged, is it able to repair itself to where it is good enough, or can it not repair itself? So skeletal muscle tissue, does it regenerate? And the answer is yes. So it regenerates pretty well. Cardiac muscle tissue does not regenerate. So if your cardiac muscle tissue gets damaged, then it is done. And then smooth muscle tissue regenerates, and really, really well. Actually, it has the best regeneration, okay, is smooth muscle tissue, okay? All right, and then in terms of muscle control, okay, so we talk about, are you able to control the muscle by yourself, just willingly, which means voluntary, or do you have no control over the muscle? Okay, so skeletal muscles are the muscles that you find like on your arms and your legs and your jaw when you move your jaw, okay, which means that you're able to consciously control them. So your skeletal muscle is considered voluntary because you have control over it, okay? Cardiac muscle tissue is found in your heart, which means that you have no conscious control over it. So we say that it is involuntary. Okay, so that means no conscious control. Okay. And then, of course, smooth muscle tissue is also involuntary, which means you have no control over it. Okay. Now, where are these located? Where they're located will tell you whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So the skeletal muscle tissue is located in your skeletal muscles. Okay. So you have control over it. The cardiac muscle is found in your heart. Okay, so you really can't control what your cardiac muscle is doing. Okay, and then your smooth muscle is found in areas of your body that are like tube-like, so we call them hollow organs. Okay, like tube-like organs. Okay, like small intestines, you know, large intestines, like your esophagus. Okay, so those will have like a simple columnar epithelial tissue, but they'll also have smooth muscle on there. Okay. What are the functions of these tissues? They're mainly for movement. Skeletal muscle, the main function of it is movement. They move stuff. When the muscle starts to move, they're squeezing stuff so the stuff can flow through. So like in the small intestines, they line that so that when they squeeze, food moves through the small intestines to the large intestines. Okay. And then other characteristics that we talk about, like in cardiac muscle tissue, we have what's called an intercalated disc. An intercalated disc, they look like striations, but they're not striations. Okay, so if you see them, I'll use a different color here. I'll use like red. Okay, so they're thicker. They're not everywhere. They're thicker. And they look like striations, but they're not striations. So that is an intercalated disc. Okay, so that's what they look like. So let me show you some pictures here real quick. And we'll look at these in lab tomorrow. But that's a skeletal muscle tissue right there. These are striations, these stripes. See how it's long and cylindrical right there? Okay, voluntary. Okay, multinucleated, so these are the nucleus. Okay, that's a cardiac muscle tissue. Do you see these branches on there? It has like branches on there. Okay, the round structure is a nucleus on there. Okay, these stripes are striations, but if you see these dark structures once in a while, those are the intercalated discs. Their function is to just help electrical signals to pass through the cardiac muscle tissue. And then the smooth muscle tissue to me looks like an eye. They look like a bunch of eyes together. Those are smooth muscle cells that make the tissue. So they're tapered. Okay, and you don't see any striations. Okay, so we'll stop there. And then next lecture, I'll talk about nervous. So the last part, the last type of tissue that we talk about during lecture is the nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is part of the central nervous system. And our central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so we talk about two types of nervous tissue, and we have neurons, and the main function of the neurons is receiving and sending electrical impulses. And then we have neuroglia that has a function of supporting the neuron. So anything that the neuron needs, like protection from microorganisms, that's the function of the neuroglia. Functions such as recycling the neurotransmitters, that's the function of neuroglia. Making sure that the neuron stays clean, like a housekeeping type of function. Neuroglia perform that for the neuron. So neuroglia mainly work for the neuron, okay? So this is the structure that I sketched on the board for lab. So it's not any different in this picture, but the head part, like we said, the head part is called the cell body, okay? So that would be this entire structure right here. We call that the cell body. And the cell body is going to, it's going to have several structures within it. So it will have the nucleus, which controls all the activities of the cell. It will have these finger-like structures, and those are called dendrites, and their function is to receive electrical impulses, like electrical messages that are coming from either another neuron or they're coming from the brain. Mitochondria that have a function of providing energy for the cell, or ATP. We call it energy or ATP. Okay. We'll talk about other structures such as Nisol bodies. Nisol bodies are structures that recycle neurotransmitters. So those are also found in here. So we'll talk about those in a lot more detail in chapter 12 when we just focus on nervous tissue when it comes to the entire chapter. Okay. Okay. And then there's this long tail we call an axon. Okay. The axon is what's going to transmit the electrical impulses through. And then, of course, the impulses will get to the terminals, and that's this tail end right here. And in the axon terminal, there will be either another neuron, or it will be the target tissue, whatever tissue or organ that signal, that message is going to, will be on this tail end right here waiting to receive that signal. So maybe this message will be passed on to another neuron and then to another. Eventually it has to get to its destination. So whoever that is, it could be an organ like a skeletal muscle, or it could be your liver, it could be your cardiac muscle tissue, doesn't matter, but there has to be some kind of destination on the tail end of these neurons so that it's eventually passed on, and the message is relayed from the brain. Okay, so whatever the brain wants that organ to do or tissue, that's what it will do. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much all the tissues that we talked about. So again, just a reminder, we have 4 types of tissue. We have connective tissue, we have epithelial tissue, we have muscle tissue, and we have nervous tissue. Okay. Now, these tissues can get damaged, and when they get damaged, of course, they have to be repaired. All the tissues would regenerate really well except for the cardiac muscle tissue. So that does not regenerate. So it will try to repair itself, but it will not restore itself to its original physical condition. That's just cardiac muscle tissue. That's just how it is. It doesn't fully repair itself. And that's why cardiovascular disease is such a problem, because the tissue itself gets damaged and cannot go through regeneration to repair itself. Okay, so typically when a tissue is damaged, some of the signs that you can tell that a tissue is damaged is you're going to see inflammation. Okay, so we talk about some signs of inflammation. So if a tissue is damaged, typically you may see some redness on there, on the tissue. For example, like if you hit your shin, okay, against something, it will start to get red. So redness is a sign of inflammation. Swelling, if it starts to swell, it means that two things are happening when a tissue swells. First of all, the volume of blood that is traveling to the site of damage is going to increase. So the volume of blood will increase because that amount of blood is bringing with it an extra amount of white blood cells in case there's an infection in the area. So the swelling will be caused by an increase in blood flow to the site of damage. That's one. And two, the swelling will be caused by that extra load of white blood cells that will travel to the site and deposit themselves in the site of damage. And so when they pack on there, it begins to swell. Okay? And the idea, the goal behind it is that in case there's an infection, then these white blood cells are going to fight the infection. Okay? Another sign of inflammation would be pain. So you might feel some pain on there. Okay? And the last one is going to be heat. Okay? So if you touch the area that has been damaged and it feels hot, that is because a specific part of your brain called the hypothalamus has been triggered to increase your body temperature to try and fight the infection in case an infection occurs. Okay, so we're not saying that there will be an infection, but if you damage a tissue, your body has to get ready for the fact that maybe you might end up with an infection. That's why white blood cells will move to the site of damage. That is the reason why your body temperature will increase, because bacteria, for example, will replicate, will make copies of themselves very slowly if your body temperature is above normal. So they don't like that. They like the comfortable body temperature, which is 37 degrees Celsius. So they like that. So when your brain increases your body temperature, it makes it uncomfortable for microorganisms, so they're less likely to replicate. Okay? Or it will actually slow down their replication. So keep that in mind. Okay? Now, again, the redness part just means that that extra amount of blood going to the site of damage will also cause redness. Okay, so those are the signs of inflammation. Typically, if a tissue is going to repair itself, there will be special cells, the fibroblasts, or they're called fibrocytes. Okay, they are going to release a lot of collagen fibers that are going to repair the damaged tissue. Okay, so that's the function of fibroblasts, or we call them fibrocytes. Okay, So their job is going to be to release all this extra collagen fibers, and they will aid in repair of the tissue. Okay, and that is what allows for regeneration to actually take place. Okay. So the last slide that we talk about is on what happens when we age. So as we get older, our tissues will start to thin out. Tissues such as epithelial tissue will start to thin out. Okay. You'll have an increased bruising and bone brittleness. So like a bone tissue will thin out. And so once it thins out and we lose a lot of calcium on there, the bones will become so brittle, and so it's easy to break those bones. Okay. Joint pain and broken bones. Okay, that's from thinning out of bone tissue. Cardiovascular disease, that's because as we get older, there'll be more damage to our cardiac muscle tissue because blood pressure, changes in blood pressure will affect how well that tissue is actually provided with oxygen and nutrients. And so some of those cells that make up the cardiac muscle tissue will start to die. And so it means that cardiovascular disease will actually increase as you get older. With mental deterioration, that's based on a nervous tissue. So a nervous tissue will basically get damaged, okay? A nervous tissue will function less efficiently, and so signals sometimes will misfire. Sometimes they'll be sent a lot slower to our organs and our tissues, and so like the brain and the body will not communicate as efficiently. Okay. Just neurons will just not be that efficient, and that's why there are issues with memory. Alzheimer's increases as you get older, the chances of getting it. So all that because of our nervous system becomes less efficient. Okay. As far as tissue cells and tissue repair, when cells repair themselves, they'll make copies of themselves. Sometimes those new copies of cells are abnormal, so they're not as a perfect repair as our original cells. And so when cells replicate themselves and you end up with new cells that have issues in them, we call those cells cancerous cells. So they just have some defects in them. They are abnormal cells. Their genetic material, so their DNA may be abnormal. And so those cells are cancerous cells. Now, if those abnormal cells or cancerous cells make copies of each other and they're already abnormal, they'll start to take over the body. And so that's how you end up with cancer, is you have your normal body cells that make copies, and along the way, while they're making copies like in a factory, like an assembly line, something goes wrong and some of those copies become abnormal, and then now everything else downstream that is made new will be abnormal. That's how we end up with cancer. Okay, it's cancerous cells are just cells that used to be normal. They are your own body cells that used to be normal, and then they became abnormal somehow, and so you end up with cancer. Okay. All right. So that's pretty much the end of chapter 4 on tissues.